Welcome to the second session of this conference. As I stated this morning, the session is on museums, reparations, and decolonization. The first speaker will be Dr. Akeia Gomes, who is currently the senior curator at the Maritime Social Histories at Mystic Seaport Museum down the road in Connecticut. She's a director as well as of the Frank C. Musson Institute of American Maritime Studies. And we are very proud to say a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Dr. Gomes is responsible for working on curatorial projects of race, indigenous histories, ethnicity, and diversity in New England maritime activities. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Connecticut, and she has done anthropological and archaeological fieldwork on the Massachusetts Pequot Reservation in Newport, Rhode Island, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, in Ghana, in Benin, New Orleans, Belize, and in Cape Verde. And I would just say, what she doesn't say on this bio is that she is the lead curator for a melon project that we have with Mystic Seaport as well as Williams College. She's the lead curator for the exhibition, which should be completed and ready for display in February 24, called Entwined. And it's an exhibition around the Indigenous and African American and Afro-Indigenous histories of the New England area for the project that we are involved in called Reimagining New England Histories. And I've gotten to know her through working on that project, and it's really, I'm not telling a false tale or speaking in hyperbole when I say that we couldn't get she's one of the, I think, most important thinkers at this moment around this question of curatorial practice and decolonization in museums.
One question that I often bring up in conversations is, and this comes from my training as an anthropologist and my longtime reliance on Marxist theory, right? Which is that you can't fix things, you have to dismantle them and then put them back together anew. And so I struggle with this question: can colonial institutions actually decolonize? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And even if they can't, is it still worth doing the work? And so I hadn't thought about this in the context of reparations ever until Tony invited me to speak today. But upon reflection, I think that the example I'm going to give you was probably my first encounter with reparations in a museum setting. When I was a college professor and an anthropologist, I was conducting field work in Rastafarian communities in the US Virgin Islands. I was living there, working there, studying things like ritual, participating in farming culture, and looking at political activism in Rastafarian communities. And so in the midst of all of this, to get me familiar with the community, one of the Rastafarians that lived in the community wanted to take me to the museum at Fort Christiansted, which is now a National Park Service site. And I would argue, even if it's on a small scale and not very systematic, my first encounter with museums and reparations. And so this museum, and you can see an aerial view of it there, and a little centuries tower there with the Danish insignia, royal insignia on top. This museum at the same time glorifies the Dutch era of ownership of the island, productivity and success, but also tries to do a deep dive into the history of slavery. And maybe it's different now, but I left that space with a very odd feeling that the story was fragmented and very colonial. So you're essentially in what Rastas said to me was if it didn't belong to the United States, St. Croix would be a third world country. But you're learning about the greatness of Denmark in this setting. And you're learning about these great Danes who were essentially enslavers on the island. And I also saw a world of something in the fact that the museum and its narrative is now owned and managed by the United States government, who now owns and manages the island. And at the same time, as was conveyed to me, systematically undermines human rights, access to citizenship, productivity, self-reliance, and food security on the islands. And so it really highlighted for me at the time, though I didn't give it much deep thought, ideas of ownership and the presentation of narratives. So we can reflect on who owns this history, who gets to tell it, why are some stories being told and others not? And the other thing I thought about was the fact that when I was there at night, I would often watch, and this was 2009, so there weren't all of these great streaming services, but you could log on to NBC.com and watch old TV shows. And so from beginning to end, I watched the series Quantum Leap, which, if you're not familiar, was about this man who would leap into different historical eras. And there were only 2 episodes I couldn't watch while I was in St. Croix. When I clicked on them, it would say, this episode is not available in your area. And incidentally, those 2 episodes took place in the civil rights era in the United States. And so it got me thinking that perhaps in a majority Black territory, it was decided that highlighting the history and legacy of Black enslavement would not be prudent in this museum setting. And the reason that I connect it to the concept of reparations is when I walked into the entrance with my friend, there was someone behind a desk that you were supposed to pay admissions to. And the person I was with walked right past that person, looked at them and said, I'm not paying to access my own history, and went in. And I just stood there for a second, kind of frozen, and then thought, well, when in Rome. And I walked in right behind him, and he proceeded to teach me about the history of slavery and Blackness, really, on the island of St. Croix. And at the time, I thought of all of this and more in the context of the specific community I was living in, because again, I wasn't yet a museum professional. I was doing anthropological field work, but I left teaching in 2017 to become a curator at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And I fell into the position by luck. I had no training in working in museums. And so the first thing I did upon getting that position was attended a conference here. The title was Encuentro. And the argument was being made in that conference that historic preservation is social justice work. And if you're not actively using your position in preservation to do social justice work, you are in fact perpetuating injustice. And I was fortunate enough at that time to be employed in a museum that allowed me to work using that perspective, and also engaged in community work and invited and respected community perspectives. And so what I brought with me from my previous work as an anthropologist and as a professor that taught human rights is that as museum professionals and as a museum professional, I need to be really self-reflexive about my own positionality and the colonial/imperial structures that put me in a place of privilege, put any museum professional in a place of privilege, whether that's class, gender, racial, global, economic, et cetera. Because this affects how we encounter history, how we are able to tell it, how we are able to critique it, and how we are able to dismantle and tell narratives, because that very professional authority exists within colonial structures. And those whose stories we're telling usually don't have access to that same privilege. And so first and foremost, and it doesn't require a lot of explanation, right? We're dealing with an inherent institutional racism. But we're also dealing with inherent contradictions in the work we do. So how do we make anti-colonial or post-colonial arguments in a museum setting when we are exhibiting the spoils of empire? When most things in our collections may be or probably are things that we shouldn't have. In addition, There are inherent colonial processes in the work and interactions of museum work. We adopt, as Bambi pointed out, this benevolent position while replicating a very paternalistic colonizer meets colonized dynamic in the museum setting, and insist that we know better how to care for objects and we know better how to frame these stories. And there are, of course, many stories of museums that refuse to return belongings because of, and by the way, I'll talk about use of language as part of this decolonial process later. So we have actively, within our project, decided to use the term belongings instead of objects to make sure that it's always clear that there is a human and community connection to these belongings. So there are many stories of museums that refuse to return belongings because of inadequate facilities. But I'm of the opinion that we don't get to impose conditions on what communities will do and how they will care for their own belongings. I would argue that if we want to truly decolonize museums and museum community interactions, first and foremost, we don't get to decide that tribal nations and Black communities or Black families won't take care of their ancestral belongings properly. We don't get to say, you don't have acclimatized spaces, so you don't get to have your sacred belongings back. And though it's nowhere near as serious, I think about it as the equivalent of someone stealing my car and then I go to get it back and they say, but I have a garage and you don't. If the community demands belongings back that should not have been taken in the first place, why would we place conditions upon their return? There are communities that may decide to leave their belongings in museums because of issues of preservation, but the museum or external government shouldn't be the one deciding that. And alternatively, instead of paternalistically saying, we can take better care, we'll keep them until you have adequate facilities, why isn't the thinking that the wealth that has been built on the backs of BIPOC peoples and Africans for centuries should be used to build them adequate facilities? The justification for protecting belongings is often that they do not belong to the community, but are rather part of world heritage. And think about the inherently colonial mindset behind that concept of world heritage, and a lack of awareness that some belongings and stories don't belong to the world, and they don't belong to anyone but the community of origin. We can think about things like sacred belongings, bodies and body parts. So, the number of indigenous peoples, ancestors that are housed in museum settings. Sarah Bartman's genitals, which were on display in a museum in France and were not returned until I think 10 years after Nelson Mandela asked for them back. Another issue is the creation of advisory committees and what's known as participation light. When museums invite communities in, it is usually in a way that's extractive, right? We want your stories, we want your belongings, but it's not done in a way that cedes any authority to the community being consulted. An example of participation light and the unwillingness to cede authority recently occurred at Montpelier and is a lesson in what happens when those in power metaphorically invite descendant communities to the table so they can be seen at the meal, but then don't allow them to eat. In a letter written by scholars participating in this Montpelier project, and this is a long quote, but I feel like I need to read the entire thing. Montpelier staff has engaged in groundbreaking efforts in what we call reparative memory work. And this would fall under the concept, of course, of reparations. They recognize that the plantations preserved to honor 4 of the country's 5 presidents are also places where Black people suffered, resisted, persevered, and survived. Yet just a commemoration of the lives of enslaved people cannot be achieved if undertaken only by museum professionals. It requires building relationships with descendants of people enslaved by America's founding presidents. Montpelier staff forged such connections to help descendants recover their family histories and create an exhibit that was powerful because it featured and reflected descendant voices. And to make a long story short, the board of that institution ultimately decided to nullify the power sharing and shared stewardship agreement in relationship with the descendants. And so in this op-ed written by the staff that was also fired as a result of this, Our research at Montpelier shows that when tour and exhibit content developed through equitable collaborations between museums and descendant communities, visitors learn more about and empathize with people who experienced, resisted, and survived slavery. By revoking its agreement with the Montpelier Descendants Committee and firing staff responsible for forging such collaborations, the Montpelier Foundation disenfranchised the very voices that should be telling America's story, thus perpetuating rather than repairing the wounds of enslavement at this presidential museum. And so having this happen at the beginning of my tenure on this project was a really good lesson in how not to do power sharing, how not to do consultation. So engaging in these decolonial processes, I always keep in mind, right, it's a very humbling project because what we're actually trying to undo, is about a half millennium of colonization and oppression in our processes. And so, it requires rethinking concepts that we use. And so I included over there on the right a Bakongo cosmogram, because in thinking about the project I'm engaged in, there's the question of, do we want to tell a story that operates in linear history? Or do we want to tell a story through the voices of community members that adheres to their concepts of time, spirituality, birth, death, and rebirth? Geography can be an issue. So the title of the overall project is Reimagining New England Histories, but even the concept of New England is colonial. The borders of the states within New England are colonial, and it doesn't recognize the collaborations and intermarriages and kinship networks and trade networks that took place regionally and beyond the region. Again, the concept of time scale. And so this is why I have the cosmogram here. And I know it's too small to see, but really, again, reaffirms that concept of circular rather than linear time. And I'm really simplifying it, but I only have a half an hour. I could do a whole semester course on that cosmogram. The language we use. So again, are they objects or are they belongings? When we talk about things like the Atlantic Ocean, do we use Atlantic Ocean or do we use indigenous terminology? So there's a lot to do, there's a lot of thinking to do around language. Interpretation of belongings. So you can imagine in museum collections, because of the people who have traditionally been cataloging museum collections, a lot of the descriptions of indigenous, African, and African-American belongings is just incorrect and needs to be corrected. And how do you go about doing that? And then there's also sort of respecting different ways of knowing. So how do we account for diversity, not only between the majority voice, the museum's voice in telling these narratives, and the indigenous or African-American voice, but how do we account for diversity and different ways of knowing within the communities? How do we speak to descendants of the oppressed and oppressors in mutually beneficial ways? And how do we then create exhibits out of those conversations? And so the title of the 2024 exhibition is Entwined: The Sea, Sovereignty, and Freedom. And so this is a collaborative, as Tony pointed out, it's a collaborative project between 3 institutions: Brown University, Mystic Seaport Museum, and Williams College. But the thing that I love about it is it's also on another level, right? A collaborative endeavor with communities, with BIPOC communities throughout New England. And so the questions that I had from the very beginning of the project and I should say, when I came onto this project, I didn't do any work in preparation because my fear was I would have all of these ideas that I thought were great and that, I did a bunch of research to come up with, and I would then go to the community and have to let those ideas or those concepts go because I really want this to be a community-driven project, not my project. And so I came in sort of blind and asked the communities, how do we frame this narrative? What's the story you want told and how do you want it told? What do you want BIPOC visitors to learn? What do you want other visitors to learn? How do you want BIPOC visitors to feel? And how do you want other visitors to feel? And that it might be the same, but it might be very different. How do we heal rather than re-traumatize? And healing is more, along the lines of what we're talking about, doing the work of reparation. So we're repairing and making communities whole. We're repairing the trauma and the fragmentation in these communities. We're not actually repairing it, right? That's a pretty bold statement, but we're working towards that repair. Working towards the repair of trauma and fragmentation caused by colonialism, enslavement, and genocide. And there's an understanding from our very first conversation as a group that all of this will take place within Indigenous, African, and Black worldviews. Decolonizing through telling community stories in a community voice is ultimately important. And also decolonizing the concept of maritime, which, if you think about traditional maritime history, has focused on the sea. But if you're working with Indigenous and Black communities, that is not how maritime is defined. And in fact, there's very little distinction, right? There's no clear division between sea and land, marshes and land, rivers and land. There's scapes that intersect and are interdependent upon one another. So telling these community stories in a community voice makes this project necessarily interdisciplinary. And when I say interdisciplinary, I'm not just talking about academics, right? So this goes back to epistemology and valuing rather than othering Indigenous and Black ways of knowing. And again, use of language. One of the things that we are working towards is use of language in the exhibition. And which New England dialects should we use? Which African languages should we use and dialects should we use within the exhibition and within the literature and within publications? There's also the goal of connecting and promoting Indigenous and African American institutions throughout the region and communities throughout the region. And ultimately, I think for all three institutions, the most important effect of all of this, when the exhibit comes down, then what? And what we're working on is creating and maintaining ongoing sustained relationships through consultation, communication, and collaboration. So real meaningful relationships with the communities we're working with. And we want to avoid, we're dealing with some hurtful histories here, some histories that people are still dealing with the legacy of enslavement, of dispossession, of poverty, of violence. And so how do we present those in an exhibition without re-traumatizing Black and Indigenous visitors? How do we provide a physical space for all visitors to debrief? We also feel the need to ask for permission to tell stories and display belongings. So I've had conversations with people who have photographs in their museum collections of people who are no longer with us. And although those photographs are owned by the museum, we will make a conscious effort to make sure we get permission from descendants to have those photographs in our exhibition. And then, my final question is, how do we lend ourselves to open discourse, which is often fraught, right, with contradictions and arguments and differing agendas? How do we lend ourselves to that open discourse where we remove our authority as scholars and museum professionals and really cede authority to community voices? Because really the museum, the academics, the scholars are one of many voices telling this story, invested in this story. And ultimately it comes down to this concept of radical trust, right? Truly shared authority and not institutional control. And of course, in the process of decolonizing, that is the most difficult part. Ceding the control, the colonial control that gives you the privilege as the scholar, as the academic, as the museum professional. Part of this, of course, is interpretation of belongings, interpretation of stories, interpretation of manuscripts in a very decolonizing way. And ultimately, when it's called for repatriation of belongings. And so one really important thing to me and work that is ongoing is identifying belongings in collections, particularly at Mystic Seaport, but whichever belongings we get for the exhibit ultimately, and properly identifying them and reaching out to source communities to ask questions of interpretation. And ultimately for me to ask the question, should we even have this in our collection, or does this need to be returned to you? And so, proper interpretation of belongings. Should we have the belonging? Also, who shouldn't touch and view this belonging? So you can imagine, particularly when it comes to sacred objects, maybe only women are supposed to touch them. Maybe only women who aren't still menstruating are supposed to touch them. Maybe only men are supposed to touch them. Maybe no one is supposed to view them except for the religious practitioner that uses it. And so finding that out is also important. I want to go back for 1 second. I talked about before reaching out to source communities for proper interpretation. But I think another part of that, and one that I glossed over, is when we talk about belongings instead of objects, ultimately it's about respecting the hands of the maker of that belonging. I attended a conference, I think it was out of Brown, maybe it was out of the Heffenreffer Museum, and it was an indigenous artist who was looking through the collections of the Heffenreffer, and he said what struck him most about walking through those spaces is he saw in his mind very little respect for the brown hands of the makers of those belongings. And so after hearing that, I said, okay, I'm not going to disrespect the hands of the makers, the hands of the communities that created these belongings, that give meaning and definition to these belongings. And so again, this is the really difficult part of decolonizing, ceding that power and privilege that comes from my authority as a PhD, as an academic, as an institutional authority. And on the subject of repatriation, I'm going to tell a very brief story, and I have to be kind of vague about it because of the issues involved, but I think it's an important narrative about proactive repatriation, meaning not waiting for a NAGPR review, understanding and identifying belongings in your collection, and recognizing when something should not be in your collection, going through the necessary steps to bring it back to the community, the source community. And so I had an encounter like this, and I'll reference it later, when I was at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It came to our attention through another curator that these belongings that we had that were very vaguely identified, they weren't even really geographically identified, but this curator saw them in a magazine and told us what they were. I'll say they were carvings. Saw them in a magazine, told us what they were, and said, we should not have these. In fact, we should not look at these. We should not move these. We should not touch these. But the description was so vague, right? We were wondering, well, how do we figure out who to get them to, who they belong to? And so we went through the necessary steps. I said, well, I'll do the research to see if we can pinpoint maybe who to at least talk to about these belongings so we can start the process of repatriation. And eventually, after a few months, found out the particular tribal nation that they belong to, because the description on these carvings wasn't even that specific. Then there was the added layer of, these are sacred belongings, but the people who would use these belongings in the tribe have to remain anonymous within the tribe. So the person I was speaking to then said, well, I have to do the work through these anonymous channels to find out who they should be returned to and how they should be returned. And there was even this hesitation, they had to be identified, but there was even a hesitation on the part of the person I was speaking to have pictures emailed so that he could identify them. But finally, after a couple months, he figured out who they should go to. I never unwrapped them. I never looked at them. I didn't want to touch them. We were in preparation for the appropriate person to come and get them so that they could be transported to the tribal nation. And I'll add, by the way, speaking of spoils of empire, this was not even a New England tribal nation that these carvings came from. We don't know how they ended up in our collection. And then COVID happened. And so I believe to this date, they have not been returned. Because the other thing we have to keep in mind is even the people within tribal nations who are in charge of repatriation have full-time jobs, have families that they need to take care of, have political obligations, and so they cannot devote full-time, full attention to these belongings. But if you're being proactive, you check in every couple of months and say, are you ready to re-engage? We still have them wrapped up and ready for you to get them when you're ready to get them. I said that was going to be a short story, but it wasn't. So some of the solutions, of course, are having these collective conversations, asking communities what they want people to learn, how they want people to feel, taking a clearinghouse approach as opposed to a single storyline, and then figuring out with consultation within the communities, how we then make that coherent, right, and create an exhibition. But importantly, openly acknowledging our limitations in representing history and presenting it holistically. We still carry the cultural baggage of our education and our colonial history when we're using wording, descriptions, timelines, timescale, and all of that in dealing with this. And one of the things I learned, my first master's level course in anthropology, is that at that time, all anthropologists in the first, in their intro chapter, laid out their theoretical perspective, laid out the problems that were inherent in their research, so that you're acknowledging those limitations and the things that you can't do from the outset. A really clear example of that took place in a Seattle museum where the curatorial staff worked really, really hard to do an exhibition on the Chinese New Year. And so they consulted with the community, they got wording, they got definitions, they got the clothing, everything. They consulted with the community from beginning to end. The exhibition went up, someone came in, looked at one of the panels and said, that's not what that word means. And we don't dress like that during New Year. And it dawned on them that the community that they were speaking with was one particular ethnic group from China who did New Year's differently than other ethnic groups within China. And so they decided to acknowledge that, right? We misstepped in putting this together. I have a very similar example from a panel that was from a whale ship that had some Chinese wording on it. And we could not figure out how to interpret it. We brought it to several different Chinese language speakers, and every person had a different interpretation. And one person finally said, well, it depends on where you're from, how you interpret these symbols and what they mean. And so we were given this very general meaning of the statement, but we could not in any definitive way interpret the meaning of that panel. So, again, we acknowledged our limitations in being able to do that interpretation. And so it brings me back to, I always loop back to my Marxist roots, right? That ultimate question of, if we are still in the master's house, right? Colonial institutions, colonial structures, we have had this very colonial education. Can the master's tool dismantle the master's house? And if the answer is no, is it still worth doing the work? And so, in my mind, even if it's not achieved, even if we don't undo racism, even if we don't fix the problem of human rights abuses, even if we don't correct history, even if we don't completely cede authority as institutions to communities, I still think there's a lot to learn in the process of trying to do that. and sort of memorializing the work in doing that, because again, we're confronting a half millennium of colonization and trying to undo it within institutions that were created to uphold colonial structures. And so I think about Eddie Daniels, and this is a man who I met many years ago, I think in 2008. He was here doing a tour for his book that he wrote about Robben Island Prison in South Africa. He was an activist fighting against apartheid. He was phenotypically what we would describe as white, which was very confusing to my students because he never talked about that versus his self-identification as Black, which he later told me is because he doesn't believe in divide and conquer. So some of his family passed for white, some of his family passed for colored. He identified as Black, even though it meant a total loss of power within society, a total loss of mobility within society. He felt to fight apartheid, there shouldn't be, he shouldn't subscribe to, well, if I identify as colored, I'll get a little more power, and that's good for me as an individual. And so he was arrested and put in the same prison as Nelson Mandela, because he was one of the activists that would do things like blow up train tracks, right, to stop the trade in diamonds from South Africa. And he said something, we took a 2-hour car ride. I was driving him to Yukon from Boston. And I was kind of taken aback when he said, I never thought apartheid would end. I said, okay, well then why'd you get thrown in jail fighting against it, right? If you didn't think it was gonna end, why were you putting your life on the line to fight it? And he said, because it was the right thing to do. And so I think about that, right? When I get that sort of feeling like, oh, we're not going to totally dismantle these systems and rebuild them. The work is worth doing because we can learn a lot in the processes, but it's also the right thing to do. And so to conclude, I just want to read an excerpt of a piece I wrote with Elizabeth James Perry. And this image is from an exhibition that I worked on with her. I wrote a piece with her on the role of museums during the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic. Elizabeth is an Aquinnah artist, culture keeper, genealogist, and the list goes on. I was working with her on this exhibition of her wampum work when I was approached by a British publisher to write the piece. Since the focus of the piece was on repatriation, it was essential to me that that come from an Indigenous voice and not mine. I can talk about it as the museum professional, but I can't talk about the true meaning of repatriation as an Indigenous person. And so here's how we concluded that piece. As museums seek to decolonize and become inclusive, multivocal and democratic institutions have a role in representing communities and heritage in the midst of both the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. It is upon us to investigate the ways we define belongings, the ways we consult with groups of people represented in our collections, and the ways we handle, display, and create narratives around belongings. It is upon us to explore, for better or worse, the ways in which belongings have come into our collections. In consultation with Indigenous, African, and African American communities, many will indeed come to the conclusion that the museums that currently house their belongings are in fact the institutions in the best position to conserve, preserve, and display belongings while collaborating with communities on issues of interpretation and historical context. Perhaps in the future, these communities will gain their rightful social, economic, and political power and will be empowered to create institutions where they are the primary scholars, interpreting and exhibiting their cultural history. Until then, it is in the best interest of museums to collaborate with communities on interpretation, handling, and exhibition of belongings, and to proactively work towards repatriation. This is crucial for healing, not only within the pandemic and not only within BIPOC and African communities, but within museums and other institutions, which have long been fragmented and afflicted with the legacy of colonialism and institutional racism. Thank you.
So yeah, we are a little over time, so maybe we can do one or two questions. But Nyambi says, I appreciate the desire to avoid re-traumatizing, but have found that being in these sacred spaces or viewing these sacred belongings with persons who do not share the sanctity of the spaces has been the source of new trauma. Is it possible to screen, in quotes, who should view these belongings? How can you tell people no in public settings?
So that's one of the things that we're working on. Are there some belongings that should be kept, that should be within the exhibition, but not necessarily on view, except when the community comes to view them, or people who, can appropriately view them are in the space. So we are thinking along those lines of who can view, who can touch, and sort of, that's one of the issues too, is not everyone that will be in this exhibit space will respect the story we're telling, will respect the perspective that we're coming from. And so we are actively figuring out how to deal with that in this space, that we want to be welcoming to African, African-American, and Indigenous peoples. But we also want to educate people who might not know this history, might not know this perspective on history, and might be resistant to this perspective on history. So we don't want to say, if you disagree with this, or if you're unfamiliar with this, you can't come into the space. But perhaps for specific belongings, that is exactly how we should handle it.
Go ahead.
Sure. So VP Franklin asks about an article on US Virgin Islands and reparations, which was published in the Journal of African American History in 2018 by Astrid Nonbo Anderson. And so they ask if you're aware of this movement in the article.
I am, and I don't know where I should be looking to answer the question, so sorry.
It's coming online.
I know, but should I be looking in the camera or? So I am familiar with it, and in fact, I got my start with my work in the Virgin Islands. There was a member of the Rastafarian community that was very active in a reparations movement with Denmark. So even though, at the time and presently, the US Virgin Islands are a territory of the United States, the reparation movement was really focused on Denmark because that is the nation that enslaved people on the island of St. Croix during the era of slavery. And this individual that I worked with quite a bit actually visited Denmark and presented Crucian culture to politicians and individuals within Denmark to make an argument for reparations. And in the conversations we had, the thinking was, look at the state we are in economically, politically, socially, and look at the institutions and the roads and the healthcare and the quality of life in Denmark, and the disconnect there, and the idea that a lot of that was built on our backs. Let's have a conversation about reparations and what that looks like on a systemic level, right? And so this group wasn't looking to the United States to remedy those problems, even though the Virgin Islands was a territory of the United States. They were looking towards Denmark to remedy those problems, because Denmark created the problem of slavery on the island. Not created, right? They benefited from the problem of slavery on the island, from the crime, as we heard earlier, of slavery on the island. And it was believed that they should pay restitution for that crime.
Can I just say to both of you, thank you very, very, very much for really wonderful presentation. So, thank you all. So we will take a break.